This man you see on the screen, Recep Tayyip Erdoğan, has been lord and master of Turkish politics for the last 20 years. And now, to the chagrin of virtually the entire Western bloc, he has won at the polls again. After surviving an obscure and bizarre coup d'etat, ramming through a constitution and implementing a bizarre economic policy that has hit the country hard and wrecked the value of the lira, Turks are still betting on Erdogan. Under his leadership, Turkey has gone from being a tolerant Islamic democracy and an example of moderation to becoming an increasingly uncomfortable partner for both the European Union and NATO. In fact, many consider that we are on the verge of a new autocracy right at the gates of Europe. For others, we are witnessing Turkey's definitive break with the West. Be that as it may, we are talking about a candidate who has been seen handing out wads of money at the doors of his polling station on election day itself. But how did we get here? And what does it all mean? How did this Turkish neo-sultan come into being? What is he after? Why did he still manage to win in the latest election? Well, we're going to answer all these questions, but first, let's get an overview of the situation with some history. Check this out. The Ottoman Empire participated in the First World War along with Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Bulgaria, in what would be the last great action of this empire, at least under that same denomination. In 1918, they were on the losing side, so the victorious allies were then able to force the then Sultan, Mehmet VI, to sign the Treaty of Sèvres. This treaty confirmed the surrender of the Ottoman Empire and meant the division of its territories outside Turkey. It also provided for international control of the city of Istanbul and the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits, the creation of a large new independent Armenian nation in eastern Anatolia, and a buffer zone for the Kurds, who would be free to choose independence after a period of autonomy. However, this treaty was never ratified by the Ottoman government due to Turkish resistance led by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, who led the so-called Turkish War of Independence. As a result of this war, the Treaty of Sèvres was replaced by the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923, which established the modern borders of the Republic of Turkey and annulled many of the provisions of the Treaty of Sèvres. Later, the Second World War was already a clear sign of what would become, from then on, the double face of Turkish foreign policy. You see, while the country signed a protection agreement with France and the United Kingdom in 1939, the successes of the German Blitzkrieg led Ankara to also sign a friendship treaty with the Third Reich around 1941. The result? The Turkish armed forces ended up being equipped with both Allied and Axis technology. But yes, in 1945, the Turks definitely went over to the Allies. It was not a particularly loyal position, but the advent of the Cold War meant that all of this back and forth was basically forgotten overnight. Competition with the Soviets prompted the White House to step up to the plate and sign a comprehensive security treaty with Turkey, which has resulted in the deliverance of large-scale military aid since 1947. And so, this is how the special relationship between Washington and Ankara, and by extension, Turkey's relationship with the entire Western world, came about. Thus, the Turkish government signed its integration with the West, joining the Council of Europe in 1949, NATO in 1952, and the OECD in 1961. However, Turkey was a country full of tensions. Externally, the deployment of US Jupiter nuclear missiles on its territory, aimed directly at the Soviet Union, put the country at the epicenter of political debate throughout the Cold War. On the other hand, internally, many politicians, little by little, were trying to implement a much more religious model for the country. This was only stopped by the pressure of the armed forces. For decades, the Turkish army was something of a shield against the growing Islamization of the country. Although even this mechanism did not always work in the most desirable way. We are talking about two coups d'etats, one in 1960 and the other in 1980. And that is not all. For decades, the country was also immersed in a great tug-of-war between state planning and market capitalism. Essentially, between the end of the Second World War and the 1980s, planning policies and control of the economy predominated. So did protectionism to supposedly support domestic industries. It was only from the 1980s onwards that the country turned to the open market and capitalism. And VisualPolitik viewers, let there be no doubt about it. Turkey's geographical position as a nexus, a point of union between Asia, Europe, and the Middle East, was absolutely crucial to this whole process. For this reason, Western institutions tried to integrate Turkey more and more. For a time, it even seemed reasonably close to joining the European Union itself. Well, that was basically the country where Erdogan grew up and evolved, a country halfway between East and West, between secularization and religiosity, between capitalism and economic planning. And so it was until the coming to power of Erdogan himself, the man who has practically refounded the country during the first 2 decades of the 21st century. Listen up.
soccer, Islam, and military pressures.
In May 1971, the Turkish armed forces issued an ultimatum to the conservative government of Süleyman Demirel and in general all political parties. The military demanded that the politicians contain the glowing religious extremism that was bringing chaos to the Republican order. This situation worsened after the onset of a severe economic crisis caused in large part by strong trade protectionism. The fact is that the crisis resulted in high levels of unemployment, over 20%, and out of control inflation. For example, while annual inflation was 15.4% in 1972, by 1980 it was already over 94%. Well, at that time, the government ordered the illegalization of several parties for being against secularization. That is to say, against the model of a non-denominational state. Among those banned formations was the National Order Party, the MNP, in which Erdogan was a militant. However, the following year, the leader of this party, Necmettin Erbakan, registered another similar grouping under the name of the National Salvation Party, MSP. Remember this name because it will be key in the future of the still young Erdogan. VisualPolitik viewers, the turbulent 1970s finally ended with a coup d'etat in 1980. That year, the military junta led by General Kenan Evren seized democratic institutions, extended martial law, banned all political parties, and imprisoned and tried tens of thousands of political activists. During this time, with politics firmly shut down, Erdogan explored other fields. For example, he tried his luck as a semi-professional footballer and managed to earn a university degree in business administration. The fact is that in 1983, under the cover of the military's new permissive legislation, the National Salvation Party was refounded into the Welfare Party and under Erbakan's command, Erdogan once again jumped back into political life. His big break would come in 1984. That year, a democratically elected government returned to power, and just then, Erdogan began to gain political influence in the opposition. He was appointed coordinator of the Welfare Party in Istanbul province. His name, little by little, began to become popular. He represented the only Islamist force with influence in the country's urban districts. And so, in 1994, with 25.2% of the vote, Erdogan became the new mayor of Istanbul. Keep in mind, this was an absolutely key moment. An Islamist party had taken control of the main city in all of Turkey. The question the country was asking itself was, what would this government look like? Would the Islamists put an end to secularism? Could they end up provoking a new coup d'etat? Well, the truth is that Erdogan knew how to play his cards. It was the perfect occasion to show that his Islamist party could be a force of majorities. And as we say around here, no sooner said than done. To the surprise of many, this mayor gave preference to management over religion. For example, he promoted a plan of public works and new technologies to solve the problems that existed in the water service, in the congested road network, and in the waste system. Infrastructure and public works were clearly his hallmark and his springboard to national politics. Suddenly, the Welfare Party seemed to have put aside its Islamist agenda to become the standard bearer for modernization in the cities. And guess what? In 1999, this evolution allowed them to become the most voted force at the national level in the general elections. However, they were unable to form a government. The military opposed them head-on and asked the other two major political parties, the Motherland Party and the True Path Party, to reach a government pact and veto the Islamists. Moderate or not, the military did not want to see them represented even in the slightest in running national politics. However, this pact lasted barely a year, and on the 28th of June 1996, Necmettin Erbakan, the founder of the country's only major Islamist political force, succeeded in becoming prime minister. And no, don't think he followed Erdogan's path of moderation. Erbakan wanted to push forward a much more Islamist agenda. Among his main points was closer ties with countries like Libya and Iran, something that was too much for the military, which forced him to resign in 1997. Shortly thereafter, the Constitutional Court itself outlawed the Welfare Party for carrying out activities contrary to the secularism of the state. And that was not all. The legal authorities also convicted Erdogan himself for inciting religious hatred. Specifically, he was accused of having used the following verses of the poet and nationalist ideologue Ziya Gökalp as a proclamation at a political rally. Take note, because he does not mince his words. It was a clear manifestation of intentions.
The mosques are our barracks, the domes our helmets, the minarets our bayonets, and the believers our soldiers.
Erdogan was dismissed from the mayor's office and sentenced to 10 months in prison. But wait a minute though, convicted for reciting some verses? Well, we have already told you that the religious question was a very sensitive topic within the country. The thing is that we could all imagine that after being impeached and imprisoned, Erdogan's political career would have come to an end. But you can see that it did not. The question is, what did he do to relaunch himself? Likewise, to re-establish his name, attain power, and gain such large majorities? Well, we're going to take a look at that right now.
Recep Tayyip 2.0.
When Erdogan regained his freedom, he was completely banned from political life. There was no possibility of becoming a candidate or to form a political party. The question was, did he really have to take on a clearly Islamist role, or should he shelve the matter to try and return to the political arena? Well, VisualPolitik viewers, it soon became clear to him. He had to seize any opportunity that came his way. His top priority had to be to re-establish his public position. After all, his role as master manager in Istanbul was still in the popular memory. And so, in 2001, when the ban on his political activities was lifted, Erdogan founded the Justice and Development Party, his political spearhead. It was a machine that arrived at the best possible moment. At the beginning of the 21st century, Turkey was a country in crisis where news like this reigned.
25th February 2001, Turkey in turmoil, faced with a financial crisis which has seen the stock market plummet and interest rates soar. Turkey has been forced to abandon efforts to maintain the value of its currency, the lira.
Average annual inflation was hovering around 60%. The unemployment rate was rising sharply, and the value of the lira had plummeted. This was the big opportunity that our protagonist was looking for. It was his moment. The religious agenda was not a priority. He had to present himself as an efficient manager, recalling his more pragmatic time as mayor of Istanbul. That would give him some social support in a difficult economic period, and also it would calm the military's misgivings. The result? Well, take a look. The elections were so fragmented that with only 34.28% of the vote, Erdogan's party won an overwhelming absolute majority. His promises of moderation and rapprochement with the European Union earned him the approval of the military. No one would stand in his way, and he would keep his word. His Islamist agenda was shelved. He also pushed through a reform package that accelerated the privatization of state-owned enterprises and lowered trade and financial barriers. As a result, foreign investment skyrocketed and Turkey experienced an economic boom. As we often say, there are times when a picture is worth 1,000 words. Well, this is one of those cases. Take a look. After Erdogan came to power in March of 2003, foreign investment soared. The measures implemented brought inflation back to single digits, and the national economy was going from strength to strength. It was what came to be called the Turkish miracle. And so, little by little, this political leader assumed more and more power, to the point that he became strong enough to put his Islamist agenda back on the table. We have told you about this in several videos that we'll link for you in the description below. After all, who was going to oppose him? He had an overwhelming social majority. He was responsible for the so-called Turkish miracle and had gradually co-opted managers from all state institutions, including the army, although not the entire army.
A leopard doesn't change its spots.
The change of political tone that Erdogan staged in order to come to power was somewhat instrumental. It did not change his deepest political convictions, Islamism, and a very authoritarian view of politics. For example, in 2013, a group of environmentalists demonstrated against the demolition of a park in the city of Istanbul. Although it was not a large-scale anti-government protest, the unconscionable repression outraged Turkish society and the entire opposition, who used the occasion to promote huge protests. The protests took place between May and June of the same year and ended with dozens of people injured, numerous journalists arrested, and strong threats against the media. And not only that, during this period, Erdogan's government tried different kinds of ways to censor the internet. For example, it restricted the use of Twitter.
26 June 2014, internet censorship in Turkey. Since the Taksim Square protests began in the summer of 2013, the Turkish government has been stepping up violence to crack down on them. A new law allows it to shut down blogs and Twitter accounts that are inconvenient to it.
Likewise, Erdogan gradually redesigned the institutions to his liking, and since 2010, prosecutors close to his party began a campaign of arrests and interrogations against senior officers of the armed forces. And so, on the 15th of July 2016, an attempted coup took place. For many, it was the sign of the military's weariness. For others, a self-coup organized by Erdogan himself to clean house. Whatever the case, the coup that resulted in 194 dead and more than 1,100 wounded failed, and this political leader took total control. Let's just say that the coup gave him the possibility to overhaul the army from the top to the bottom. Already without the counterweight of the army, in 2017, Erdogan promoted a constitutional reform that gave the ruler the power to dissolve parliament and even appoint half of the constitutional court. From that moment on, all indicators of freedom have fallen in the country. The persecution of opponents has become frequent and the media has been gradually tamed, if not completely controlled in most cases. To make matters worse, from that moment on, foreign investment began to plummet and Erdogan brought to the table an economic policy based on Islamic dogmas, for instance, against interest rates, which has destroyed the value of the lira. In a way, Turkey has become more and more like Russia, a country with which, despite being a NATO member, it maintains practically full relations. Do you want proof? Take a look at this.
27 April 2023, Erdogan and Putin celebrate cooperation on Turkey's first nuclear power plant.
Nevertheless, despite all of this, Erdogan has won the elections again. Check this out.
A political earthquake.
In February of this year, the Turkish city of Gaziantep suffered a terrible earthquake, which killed more than 55,000 people. The lack of assistance and the government's disastrous handling of the tragedy seemed to open the door to political change.
The economy is in ruins. AKP, Erdogan's party, has depleted reserves and has vastly expanded pledges and spending to bolster its patronage network. I don't know how the country can avoid economic collapse. Darren Acemoglu, economist and MIT professor.
What's more, most of the opposition united under a single candidacy, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, who became the most favourite candidate. And yet, he lost. He lost in the first and the second rounds. The Turks have taken a bet on a political leader who has shredded civil liberties, provoked an economic crisis, and has clashed with NATO and the European Union. And all apparently for one very clear premise: to make Turkey a great Islamic power. Erdogan has nurtured an unbridled nationalist sentiment that has now given him victory. We could say that he's become a kind of Putin in Turkey. Once a moderate politician with a zeal for renewing ties with the West, today he's become an almost kind of nightmare, an ally more uncomfortable than many enemies. The question is, how far do you think Erdogan will go? Will Turkey continue to fall down the slippery slope of autocracy? Will this country become the kind of Russia of the Middle East? You can leave us your answers in the comments below and let's open a respectful debate. And now, if you found this video interesting, don't forget to like all of us here at VisualPolitik and subscribe if you haven't already done so. All the best, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next time.